Does God care about small places? How can we faithfully serve Christ in a rural context? What is the future of the church in rural America? The Rural Ministry Podcast deals with questions like this and much more in the hopes of bringing practical resources and inspiring stories to help the church flourish in rural communities. Dr. Charlie Cotterman is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of a rural church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. Join the conversation as we journey into the good things God is doing in small places. All right, well, welcome to another episode of the Rural Ministry Podcast, where we talk about the unique challenges and joys of living and doing ministry in rural places. I'm your host, Garrett Heath, Director of Media and Communications at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College, and I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Dr. Charlie Cotterman. Charlie is the Executive Director at the Center for Rural Ministry, Assistant Professor of Biblical Studies at Grove City College, and the pastor of Oil City Vineyard Church in Oil City, Pennsylvania. So today we bring you our second episode in our series entitled Raising Leaders. And that's a topic that's come up a lot in our conversations on rural ministry thus far, and I think for really good reason. Joining us today is a special guest, Adam Loretto, who is our colleague and friend at the Center for Rural Ministry. Adam is the Assistant Director at the Center for Rural Ministry and an Associate Professor of English and Writing at Grove City College. And perhaps most importantly, Adam organizes faculty basketball every Tuesday at noon at Grove City College.
That's right.
So we like to think, actually, at the Center for Rural Ministry that we would have the best 3-on-3 team of any center, department, what have you. So if anybody wants to challenge us at some point.
That's right. The gauntlet has been laid down right there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So just let us know. But on the topic of today's conversation, Adam did recently write an article for Lifeway Research entitled Developing Leaders in a Rural Church. So I can't really think of a better segue into today's chat. So thanks for joining us, Adam.
Yeah,
thanks.
We're glad you're here, Adam. I think this chat's going to be really fun because you've been thinking a lot about this. You have some research to pull in. And then we have this we're going to hopefully go from kind of some of this research to launch into a longer conversation today. And I think the three of us have a cool mixture of, because I serve as a pastor. So I have kind of an angle from the pastoral lens, but both of you are involved as lay leaders in your churches and churches really with varying different kinds of polity and things. So I think it'll be fun to have this conversation together. But maybe, Adam, you can just pull us into this because it is a perennial need. For as long as we've been part of this ministry at Grove City College, working with pastors, when we ask pastors periodically, like, what would you like? It's always one of two things. Usually it's discipleship and leadership development. Those are the two things that come up year after year when we ask groups of pastors, what would you like us to focus on? And so I thought, this is a great chance in this little mini series on our podcast to really tackle one of those, which is leadership development. So Adam, I don't know, do you want to tell us a little bit about what pastors are saying in the latest Lifeway research?
Yeah, exactly. We're not surprised to see when we released the Lifeway research a couple months ago that leadership development was one of the biggest issues that pastors talked about within their ministries, because, again, we have seen it over years and years just in our own work with local pastors. And so certainly that was not surprising. We wanted to make sure that we did pay attention to where things seem to be going well, right? One is that churches certainly know of needs in their communities, they're doing what they can to address them, right? So pastors know that they need to be developing ministries around teens and youth, around children, around particular women's ministries or elder care, right? Many churches have some kind of program that they are focusing on different needs within the community, and they are being missional in those areas, right? Not a surprise that they see that need. And a lot of the pastors express that they have leadership that do help in those areas, right? It's not all falling on them, and those are good things. What we realize is that one thing that can become an issue is when one or two leaders are, involved in 3 or 4 or 5 different ministries of the church, right? And that is a pattern that we can pretty clearly point to just within our own experiences. Probably that people tend to be involved in a lot of different ways. So that is something that we want to pay attention to. Think about, okay, where are some ways we can help with some of those issues, because pastors do identify leadership development as one of their biggest needs. And we also found it interesting that in the data that we got from this Lifeway survey, there was no distinction between a small church and a large church in saying that. It doesn't matter if you have a big budget for ministry or a small budget for ministry. Everyone says we want more leaders. We want to do a better job of that. And so that was what the data was telling us. And so when Lifeway said, do you want to write an article? I looked at this leadership development piece as a place where I wanted to pay some attention because of our experience with that, both from the Center for Rural Ministry and just personally, as you said, being leaders in churches. And so this is not us coming up with some grand plan or anything like that, but it's just what are some of the things that have kind of spoken to me as I think about what it means to try and lead, and where I've seen leadership grow in churches and in some places like that. And so that was what I ended up kind of pointing to in a couple of pieces in the article that came out.
Yeah. And by the way, we're going to link to that article in our show notes. It's really helpful. Lots of good links in your article too. So you can just keep going down kind of the rabbit holes as through that article. But I think even in your article, as I'm looking at it right now, I think you're getting at, and our survey that we did with Wheaton and Rural Home Missionary Association gets at this. It's hard for pastors, I think, to really put their finger on what they're looking for in leadership development. We all know there's something there, but we can't. And this is what makes it so hard. We don't know how to get from like the desire for it to figuring out exactly what it's going to look like. And here's what I mean by that. So they have all these things. And I mean, I forget the percentage. I'm going to have to look back here. It was something like 77% of rural pastors indicate they see members of their churches stepping into leadership, right? And then you have all these ways that they're stepping in: youth, women's ministry, and there's, high percentages. And 2 of 3 pastors, 65% agree they spend time developing these leaders. But then we get into the kind of question mark. 53, half of rural pastors, the 53%, say that the congregation looks to them to do most of the ministry work. And for me, those things don't jive. Like 77% of them say people are involved in this, but then over half say the congregation looks to them to do most of the work, right? And then, 40% are facing exhaustion. And then when they list the challenges of these 1,000 plus pastors on this interview, the most selected response was developing and empowering lay leaders. So 77% say they have lay leaders stepping into leadership. 53% say most of the church, though, looks to them, and their biggest challenge is developing lay leaders. To me, those things don't all add up. There's like real questions around this.
There's a disconnect there, right?
There is, right? And so we definitely aren't going to be able to answer that huge question on this one podcast, but we are aware of it, I think. And I think just being aware, like, there's something going on that we can't quite put our finger on yet in the local church when it comes to developing leaders and when it comes to pastors' sense of what the expectation is on us, that we need to just be aware of. So we're just admitting that from the front, that there are these needs and these questions.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because I guess it partly becomes a dispositional question, right? So as the pastor on the podcast, maybe you can think about this is, where is it there's leadership there if I'm willing to give it over? And where is it I really don't know if there's enough there that I can trust giving it over, right? That's a question that I think is a tension that we all are feeling.
That's right. And I think we'll get to a couple of those conversations later on this podcast. And maybe part of it does come down, just as anyone that's been involved in an organization as the kind of like buck stops here person knows that there's a different level of fatigue and exhaustion that's even mental that comes with that, just knowing you carry the responsibility. And some of that you just can't get rid of as a pastor. So maybe that's part of what we're seeing in this. Mm-hmm. But Adam, maybe you could talk a little bit. You have a great piece in this article on paying attention and looking. Would you care to talk a little bit about, how that resonated with you and even in your own experiences?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear the whole question. Sorry, you have to go back and edit
Yeah,
that.
just the idea, and we're kind of making a transition here because we're recognizing that there are these questions that we can't necessarily answer, but there are ways to at least start in the right direction of developing leaders and answering these questions in our local communities. And in your piece, you talk about like how to pay attention and even give a story from your own experience. And I thought maybe, the idea of looking, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but paying attention, being attentive to what God's doing in the communities you're in the people you're working with. So maybe you can start by talking about that, because I think that is one of the first steps to developing local leaders.
Yeah, and I think this is part of that movement of trying to distribute a little bit what it means for the vision of the church, right? It doesn't mean that the pastor has to have all the answers about what programs do we need and what do we need to do, but it's that idea of paying attention is a little bit on where do we see the community already investing in ways that maybe they don't fully name as being kingdom work, but with a little bit of storytelling, with a little bit of kind of coaching, it can become that in some key ways, right? So how is it that you happen to notice within the congregation there are people who are already, the mechanic that everybody calls up when something's gone wrong, or the person that's always the first to bring a meal to the new mom, or the person who's gotten sick, right? Seeing that there might be these things that don't have the structure and imprimatur of a church on it, but just to say, you know what, we want to support and bless that work that you're doing. Yeah, you're already doing this, but if we brought along 2 more volunteers, what more could you do? Right? Some of it is just seeing where the congregation already is doing stuff that is kingdom work, and that you just want to support them and bless them in that, and telling stories around that. Mm-hmm. Making sure that it's not something that, of course, you're not doing it for the recognition, but helping as a pastor to see where the care in the congregation already goes. Those are things that can be encouraging to the broader congregation, call them to see their own actions as being done in the service of God for the goodness of the community and the kingdom that is being built. I think those are all things that we want to hear more of. And I think that's helpful. And then it is in that sense of paying attention within the congregation, looking and saying, like, could there be someone who, whether this is the Holy Spirit leading me, whether this is just me kind of paying attention in a particular way to someone to say, I see God may be working in you in a particular way. Might this be an opportunity, right? So the story I tell in the article is that the woman who leads the youth for our church, she's doing it on a volunteer basis. She needs other volunteers. She's not afraid just to ask, just to say, you know what, you've done some interesting things for this church. Could you help us lead the youth girls group, do some discipleship and mentoring of girls? For my wife and me, she came to us and said, we want the students to learn a lot about how to just listen to a sermon. They're not used to listening to a sermon when they get into 6th grade. How can we kind of model that in a way where we have monthly conversations around sermons and just have that conversation? Could you help and be part of that? Right? She just comes, makes the ask, gives kind of a direction and a reasoning to it, just to say, like, could you lean into this and could you think about being part of this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I think one of the things that to develop leaders, one of the things we have to actually do is model some of these things. And I think people aren't necessarily used to looking like for this kind of thing. Here's what I mean by that. I think we are quick to supply people's no, to say no, like, oh, I don't want to ask them because whatever reason, I'll say no for them. Mm-hmm. Instead of actually just saying, hey, you're on my heart. I've noticed you, that like God's giving you these gifts. I've noticed you. Would you consider? And then they can say no. We can do it in a low pressure ask where they can actually supply the no. But when we supply the no for them in advance, we actually cut off that opportunity, right? And so learning how to pay attention. And honestly, I think as a pastor, honestly, as a professor, as a parent, part of my job is actually helping people just learn how to pay attention. That's really what I do as a professor. It's what I do as a pastor. And with my kids, like, we can go through life oblivious to so much around us. I mean, I'm guilty of it. We're probably all guilty of it. So, like, when I point out this sunrise today, guys, on the way to school is amazing. I do that to help them see the world, right? And then once in a while, it doesn't happen that much, when they're like, hey, Dad, did you notice the moon? Or did you notice this? And I'm like, oh, they're learning how to pay attention, right? As pastors, as leaders in the church, lay leaders too, when we model paying attention to what God's doing in people, we're actually creating a culture where leadership can happen. And I think part of this too is actually literally asking the Holy Spirit to help us identify people, identify the people we need. God will supply it. And so sometimes it's actually just a prayer, like, God, help me see your solution to this. Now, I want to say something about another poll that you referenced in your article and that I found really interesting, is this Gallup and LOR, I'm not sure if that's how you say it, LOR report. It's a philanthropic organization in the Mountain West working in rural communities, funded by a Swiss billionaire, but that's beside the point. The idea is there's an organization working in the Mountain West to help empower rural communities, and they teamed up with Gallup, and they did this report, which we're going to link to in our show notes. And what they found is that 46% of rural residents would like to be more involved in their communities, and over 20% of rural Americans report being very or somewhat motivated to start local projects, which that's a fascinating amount of people in, these aren't pastors, these are lay people, these aren't even Christians, just people in our communities that want to be involved in leadership. But here's what they found: only 10% have actively led in the past. And so the question for us is, all right, if 46% of people say they'd like to be more involved in their communities in small towns, and that probably holds at least true, if not more, for churches, because they're already self-selecting to be more involved. How do we span that divide? Paying attention is the first thing. And then I think, to your point, Adam, in your story, intentionally inviting is the second. So let's maybe...
And to interject here too, from my perspective as a layperson, as a lay leader, even in my church, like, I think to your point about supplying the no for somebody, just assuming that they're going to say no. I think it's important, probably from a pastoral perspective, to view that as also low pressure on your side. Like from a lay leader position, somebody asks me to, take part in this ministry or lead it or head it up, even if I don't have the time, and end up saying no, what that has still done is it has cracked the door open to let me know that I can lead something. So there's this space kind of welcoming there, I think, that can happen. So even if I say no, it gets my wheels turning, right? Well, what do I have the capacity for? Where could the Holy Spirit be leading me? You know what I mean?
That's right.
I think that's an important.
And also, coming from a lay leader perspective, I almost wonder if that ask is better if it doesn't come from the pastor.
Yeah, sure.
Someone else who's like, hey, we're in kind of the same boat here. I've been involved with this. I wonder if this is something that you could be involved in too. It's a lower pressure, and it's a little more, we're coming at this from the same level, rather than, right, there's that, authority of the pastor saying something. You feel a little more locked in or bound up in some way by that.
Yeah. Well, and the reality too is, like, the pastor gets paid to do this work, and the lay people, this is an add-on to their job, right? So there is sometimes a sense in communities where, like, well, that's your job, pastor. And yes and no, right? Like, there's a yes and no to that. But that's why I think it's really important for there to be strong relationships between lay leaders and the pastoral staff, or the pastor, if it's a solo pastor church, which many are, so that there's this kind of like realization that different people can ask in different ways, and we need to be working together, right?
Yep.
And by the way, I wanted to tie all of these, like, these leadership points, these are not things that are just making up out of nowhere. I mean, think about Jesus. When we're talking about looking and attending, we have Matthew at his tax booth. No one else is noticing him as a potential leader, but Jesus, with the Holy Spirit lens, is seeing him. Or Peter and Andrew at their nets, right? He's paying attention to who's around him. These aren't people that have gone through the latest leadership class. They're just people Jesus knows through the power of the Holy Spirit in him that they have leadership in them. And then the idea of inviting, how many times even in John's gospel is Jesus like, come and see, right? So many times you're like, just come on come on, follow me, right? The basic invitation. And I think that's something I want to transition from attention to invitation. One of the things I think we need to think about when we're raising up leaders in our communities is this idea that like our entire lives can actually be an invitation. So like when I was a youth leader, I loved guitar. I wanted to be in a worship band, and every kid in the youth group pretty much knew that. Like you couldn't hide it. And so there was this invitation by my very like carrying a guitar around and saying, hey, you want to play a chord over here? Like I was inviting them to be part of something. And I think when we love our towns, when we love our church communities, it's an invitational gesture. Love is contagious. When you love something, people around you will figure it out, right? And so there's a way in which the invitation isn't just a word, but it's actually a posture to a place and to a people. Do you guys think that makes sense?
Yeah, that Gallup poll that you mentioned, right? That idea of love and commitment to something is a lot of what they say, right? That as you help other people see the value and love that they have within the people of God in the congregation and for their community, that's part of what sparks their desire to become involved and committed, right? So if you can be that model of that invitation and that love and attention to the place, right, that's meant to draw others in as well.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's this, all these points that we're talking about, the key here is really this relational situation that we're creating, where we actually care about people, we're investing in each other. It's a two-way street. And I think those are the circumstances where, leaders can kind of naturally develop, right?
Mm-hmm. And it's also where we avoid the guilt motivation to be a leader and move to the positive, I want to, right? It's like the intrinsic motivation versus the kind of like, the obligation piece of it. I mean, anything we do is going to have an obligation sometimes. There's going to be those days, right? We all like our jobs, but there are probably days, okay? I'm not going to speak for you guys. I'm going to speak for me. There are days where I don't always want to do it. There's an obligation piece, but there's also, especially when you're doing something for a community, there's a sense of out of love. And that's what this other poll from LOR and Gallup shows. I want to just read one more quote from this. Although financial resources are often needed to start a project, people need more than that. In fact, when asked what would make them more likely to lead, most rural Americans point to relationships and resources. Connection to others is the top motivator, 65%. So if you want people to lead in your church, help your church be really well connected, right? If you want your people to lead outside the walls of your church, help your church be really well connected in its community, right? That is the top motivation for service in the community. And then secondly, and not far behind, is easy access to financial support, 64%. Then you have things like seeing others in action, greater awareness of what's worked, information about local challenges, and even having a mentor, which is a thing we'll talk about in a few more podcasts from now. But connection to others and then financial support, those two things. Honestly, the local church can do both of those because there aren't many philanthropic organizations that people in small towns have as ready access to as the local church. Now, local churches might not have big budgets, but they usually have a little bit of extra money for this or that ministry in their communities, and leaders can tap into that. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think these local churches are like the main point of contact, right, between potentially somebody within that church who has a heart for something or somebody and the community itself, right? So how can the local church just facilitate something that God might be stirring within somebody, and then resource them to do just that? And oftentimes these aren't big budget items, right? We see this with these micro grants, right? That even the CRM has been putting out over the last few months. Like these don't have to be big ticket items, but just the resources to accomplish a day's work for a building project, whatever it is. These can be simple things, but the church can be the one to resource that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's the idea of the benevolence fund, that the church has set aside something for someone in the community, right? It's not coming with a lot of strings attached, right? But it's to be that touch point for someone in the community who comes in with a need. and it's a couple $100 for rent or for heating for the month, right? Those are things that show someone some love and care in a particular way, and right, hopefully is something that the church is using to tell the story of Jesus to the community, but also to each other, right? And I think this is key as well, that the storytelling that the church is doing about how we're invested in our community matters, not to pat ourselves on the back, but to say, like, we are continuing to care about who God has put in the vicinity of our church. And that the more we tell stories and remind the congregation about who we're serving and why, and the various opportunities God has brought through the door, whether those people end up in a service or not, it's still telling us about what is the action of God's people in this community and why we want to all be connected to that and invested in that.
Yeah, that's right. And those stories build that connection that survey speaks to, right? We're connected even in history. Like, this church has done this. Let me tell you what happened 50 years ago when my grandma was here and how we served, So those stories connect us to the town, to our church, to history. Totally. All right. I want to move from inviting to investing. And it makes sense when we're talking about, churches and benevolence funds and investing. And by the way, as a pastor, I'll tell you, sometimes a pastor is the last person to know of a need in a church or a community. This is where we need lay leaders who have their feet on the ground, in businesses, in schools, and places like that, because your pastor just doesn't know everything happening in your community by and large, right? And so if we want to actually put the church's benevolence fund even or things to work really well, we need lay leaders. And speaking as a pastor, we need lay leaders to actually come to us with ideas and come to us with just news in our community that we might not have heard of, right? So that's a way that we can start to think about investing is in our communities through our lay leaders. But how do we invest in our lay leaders? And I think Jesus, again, provides this amazing example. 3 years working with these guys. I mean, and these are not cream of the crop. So many people, they want to work with, give me your best and brightest, I'll work with them. But this is your average person, maybe below average in some cases, that Jesus is taking under his wing for 3 years, right? His talent, his treasure, his entire life gets invested into these people. What a ride looking back, right? For them, somewhat bumpy ride. But how do we do that kind of thing in our local churches? I think it's everything from, asking the Holy Spirit to highlight people that you're just going to just be involved in their life. Maybe it's a text here or there. It's a breakfast once in a while. I think there's also intentional ways that churches can build up leaders. And I've actually experienced this in our church recently. So I might have talked about this before on the podcast, but when we planted a church, we had young family. We were pretty intentional about not having a lot of evening stuff. So I've guarded evenings pretty hard, especially as a bivocational pastor. But this year we had some folks that said, hey, our denomination is doing this Vineyard Leadership Essentials course, and they're offering it for churches. Would you guys think about leading that? And I prayed about it and talked with Amy about it. And we were like, you know what? We really believe in this. And so we just opened up our home once a month to host people that say, I want to be a leader. And we thought we'd have a few. We had 18 people say, I want to take this. Our house is bursting. It's not that big. It's bursting when these folks show up. But we're just walking through this curriculum that our denomination provided, and it's raising great questions. And then when Christmas Eve came, and it was I need all these people to do different things. And, we don't have teams for this because it's a one-off service, but I need help with this and this. I said, oh, you know what? We have 18 people in our Vineyard Leadership's Essential class. And I could just put the call out. And you know what? They responded immediately and they filled in every gap. And so investing for me, it made me rethink man, there are these strategic investments in developing leaders that are, that sometimes they're very organic and grassroots, but sometimes they are very intentional and they're programmatic, but it still helps people step into things because you don't always know who wants to be that gap, right? Between 10% that have led and 22% that want to. You don't know who that 12% of folks are all the time until you give them an opportunity to say, hey, who wants to be a leader? And they're like, oh, I do. And you had no idea. Mm-hmm. Then let's move on. For the sake of time, I'm gonna move on to another one, which is actually harder. And this gets to something you talked about earlier, Adam. Harder than we think is releasing leaders, right? So Jesus models this 2 by 2 for the 12 and then the 70, and then he releases the church in Acts, right? And here's the thing about releasing leaders. You actually have to release them. They can't be like onto them so tightly that they're not leading. They're just like doing the things you want to do, but you don't have enough hands to do, right? You have to release them. And I think this can be really hard because honestly, as a pastor, sometimes that church becomes like your little world, and you want to be like playing chess with it. You want to make the moves. It's an easy temptation, but the reality is no pastor, no matter what the size of the church is equipped to make all the moves him or herself. And we need to release these leaders out into it. Have you guys sensed like how you've seen that show up, maybe a positive or maybe a negative example over the course of your life in just folks being just allowed to participate and to lead?
What's coming to mind actually is kind of within the Center for Rural Ministry work that we do in some ways. There's a decent number of programs where we do sort of say to a student or a faculty member, this is on you at this point, right? So we have mission trips that go out over spring break, and we love it when we get to help them plan and talk about it. But at the end of the day, they make the call on where they're going to go and who they're going to talk to. And when it comes to service learning projects, it's, here's an idea, here's a faculty member that's going to run it, and here's a church that they're partnering with. And we don't kind of manage every step of what happens there. And some like our batting average is great. We love what has happened in so many of these trips, but not all of them have been quite of the same quality as the others. And right, not every church ministry is quite as impactful as you would hope it would be. But you see how when other people get the chance to make the decisions and lead, they're going to learn and grow and do a better job next time. Even if it's not exactly the way I would have done it. Yeah, sure. Right. It still comes out, and God still is honored through it.
Yeah. And I speaking of this releasing, I would say, speaking to you as a pastor, Charlie, like, I think from a pastor's perspective, it can be easily underestimated how significant that releasing is, right? Because we tend to look at this in a very results oriented way, right? Where we're hoping to get this result from, this ministry and this releasing. But from, I think, a lay leader's perspective, that releasing, and I mean a genuine release, not just like lengthening the leash, but a genuine release, I think, speaks about trust, right? And when trust is there, that responsibility is now felt on my end. I'm motivated to like pull this off, right? And I think that's also important in how we continue this relational model, right? Like, without the releasing, that relationship can't really blossom into like its fullest extent. And I think that over time, this can build, situation by situation, and this is how leaders can really be developed, I think, in the long term, and entrusted with more, right?
Absolutely. And I think I think you're right on there. And as I think about it too, the image, I have this image coming to my mind of like being on a lake, right? And there's all these places you could go on the lake to kind of, do different things. Like, and this is like our ministry field, right? And there's a difference between giving someone like a paddle and a boat, and they may not be the best, oarsmen ever, but you've given them a paddle and boat, and you release them now, and they're not ever going to be 100% prepared. There's a difference between that and like dropping someone overboard, right? And so when we talk about developing leaders, like, we really need to, as pastors, like, evaluate, like, how are we preparing people for success? We're never going to prepare them for 100% security and success in the ministry that they release into, but we can actually help equip them that they're not just going into something that is like the chances of success are so, like, unless they're an amazing swimmer, they're never going to do it, right? And I think that's something, because here's what I think happens. Pastors, it's easy to carry the load until you realize suddenly, and it usually comes pretty suddenly, I can't do it. And then you get desperate. And then you're like, I need a leader right now. And then you end up throwing people overboard instead of sending them out in a ship with an oar, right? And so that's where, as pastors, I think, and anyone in church leadership, because this can be lay leaders too, right? Like the Sunday school superintendent needs a Sunday school teacher tomorrow. Like part of helping people be released well is actually being secure in like God ourselves. So we're not dealing out of insecurity, and trying to actually lean into kind of seeing people for real people that we don't want to burn out, and not just people that can accomplish a task, right? And that's something that's on the leaders to do, on us as pastors, on lay leaders. So there's more to be said about that. Maybe it's another podcast sometime, but there's something more to be said about releasing is a huge part of it. I want to say a couple quick things. I know we're coming up on our time. One of the things that we can't talk enough about today, but we need to at least mention, is this idea of when you raise up leaders, you're going to face disappointment and betrayal. It's just the way it goes. The disciples, Jesus goes up on the mountain. He has a transfiguration. He comes down. The disciples have a major problem on their hands. They can't heal a desperately needy man's son, right? Jesus, he wonders like, oh, guys, I thought you had this one, right? Like there's disappointment. Sometimes people are going to let us down, even if it's not like a moral failure or something. It's just like they just don't live up to our hopes. And then there's actual outright betrayal. And this will happen. Anyone in leadership is going to experience this at some point. We always think it won't happen to us, and then it does. It's just the way it is. And I think this is something we need to talk about more down the road, kind of the healing process around it and how to think about it. But I just want to name that can happen. But if Jesus has experienced it, you know that it can happen to the best of the leaders, right? It's not that you're necessarily a bad leader if that happens to you. It's just this is the way we humans are. So more to be said. I want to maybe leave us with this image today of something that just I hadn't even thought about this until I started typing the notes for this. And then I thought about, man, what does it look like to see your ability and our ability to raise up leaders over the long haul, and to just think about like how God could use you in the flourishing of his church, and you think about, like, I just read with my students every first day of class, Psalm 1, the tree planted by the stream of water. And there's this idea of a flourishing tree. And then just because I'm the kind of person I am, I thought about coaching trees. And I thought about Stephen's coaching tree. I was just in a conversation where someone was talking about a coach they didn't love in the NFL. And they're like, there was this article about how he has no coaching tree anywhere doing like major things. And then someone's like, it always comes up, oh, well, think about Nick Saban's coaching tree. All the leaders he's raised up, and now they're coaching, in major college teams and major games and having a lot of success. And I find that to be really inspiring. Honestly, at the end of my life, I want to just be someone that helps facilitate other people to do great things. And it takes all the things we talked about. It really takes releasing. And sometimes that's not going to feel good, right? When the coach you've been raising up says, I'm going to take this other job. But I think that's something as pastors we can think about. How is your life? How is our lives? How are our lives like inspiring people to say, you know what? God's good. I can trust him. I can take a step out in faith, and at the end of the day, every coaching tree goes back to the real vine, Jesus, right? So we're just playing a small part in it, but it's a part that I'd like to think we could each play.
Well said. Well said. Well, I think that's a wrap for this week's episode. We hope our conversation has provided you with some encouragement, insight, maybe even a practical idea for your own ministry context. The Rural Ministry Podcast is part of the good work being done at the Center for Rural Ministry at Grove City College. If you found this podcast helpful, there are a few free things you can do to help us out. First, you can share this episode with a friend or colleague who could benefit from it. Second, you can leave us a review on your favorite platform. This helps more people discover our show. And lastly, you can leave us a comment or suggestion on the episode page over at the Center for Rural Ministry YouTube channel. We hope to get some good conversations started over there as well. So thanks again for listening, and you can learn more about our mission by visiting www.ruralministry.org. Have a great week.